Hello everyone, today we talk about tanks in the Spanish Civil War, and for this we have a special guest, Gareth Lynn Montes. He's an editor at the Tank Encyclopedia website and also the Tank Encyclopedia magazine. He's from Spain, so he knows the source situation far better than I do. And as such, yeah, we talk about the Spanish Civil War, and additionally he has a master's in international relations. Welcome, Gareth.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So, when it comes to tanks in the Spanish Civil War, most of them were sent from foreign powers. So, particularly the Soviet Union sent about 330, Italy about 155, and Germany about 120. But I have, when I looked up a bit on Wikipedia, so correct me if those numbers are not correct, but also France and Poland supplied a total of about 60 tanks. Of course, mostly Renault FT, so around First World War equipment. So for me, several questions arrived. So in terms of timing, when did they arrive? Did they arrive in batches, or did they arrive all at once, or what trickle down, or how did the tanks arrive? Also probably very different for the different sides.
It's different for each side, and even within the nationalists, for example, the ones that arrived from Italy and the ones that arrived from Germany were in completely different circumstances. So to think about this, it's probably best to think about it in individual tanks. So we'll start with the Panzer One, for example. Um, Germany Germany had some experts on the ground, and they played a very important role in the very early stages of the Civil War, primarily through air means. So they helped the Army of Africa, which was the most professional, the elite force within the Spanish army that was stationed in North Africa, to cross into mainland Spain to support the coup and the nationalist side. So that was their early involvement. But German experts on the ground realized that, said, well, if they are to win the war, they're going to need modern equipment. So they started liaising with. This was really early in the war. So the coup was in July 17th, 1936, and by September is when, well, by September and even earlier is when these conversations are happening. And they're saying, well, they need this support. And in the end, I think it was at the end of September, 41 Panzer Ones, Ausf, set sail to southern Spain, to Seville, and they arrived on October 7th. And one of the, I think is quite well known, but it's always worth mentioning, these German the German crews of these for the Panzer Ones were supposed to be tourists. And
Yeah.
there is lots of pictures early in the war, and they are dressed like tourists. And it's ironic of how German tourists between 1936 and today haven't changed much in coming to Spain. And that's they came first, and the role of these crew members was to instruct the Spanish crews, and it was very clear that the German tanks were not to partake. A second batch, this time of Ausf, Panzer One's Ausf, arrived at the end of October, and then a third one came, which was 10 were sent at the end in early 1937 to overcome casualties, or the ones that had been destroyed or were no longer usable. So those vehicles were the only ones, those three batches were the only ones sent officially as aid or by Germany.
Wasn't it how's it called, agricultural equipment as well? I
Yeah,
mean,
well,
the
yeah,
German.
well, yeah, well, those were agricultural equipment. Is a term that has been used many times throughout history as a
Despite
term. But
Spanish mole rats that are threatening nationalist farmers.
yes, yeah, absolutely. But again, on the fake names and like fake motives, those weren't the only Panzer ones that arrived in Spain. There was two additional batches of 18 and 20 tanks, which arrived in mid 1937 and early 1938, and those were sent through a dummy company, which was set up by Germany to make deals in Spain. So those were bought by Spain from Germany rather than Germany sending them. So in total, 122 Panzer Ones, mainly Ausf. 96 of them were Ausf. 21 of them were Ausf. There was one training vehicle, Ausf. Training vehicle, which didn't have the top superstructure, and there were four command vehicles, LSV command vehicles. So yeah, so again, different batches, but by the end of 1938, the last Panzer ones had arrived. The Italians, their involvement in the Civil War again was quite different. They were quite keen on, they were their own independent thing. They sent combat troops which partook in battles, whereas the Germans were mainly, the ones that did take part in battles were mainly in the Air Force.
Yeah, they were instructed not to take part, but from what I read, they took part in some cases, although they were
in some cases,
prohibited.
in some cases, in some limited numbers, their main task was instruction. And again, the instruction wasn't just in how to drive a tank; it was in tank maintenance, which on the national side was very effective because they maintained a load of tank. I think there was one of the out of 122 tanks that the Germans sent, 126 were maintained. So several tanks were maintained twice. But the idea was that at least on paper, at least every vehicle went through the maintenance, well, at least once. But yeah, so instruction in how to use flamethrowers, instruction on how to use anti-tank weapons, lots of instructions. Well, as I said, whereas the Italians were more keen to send troops, and I think it was very much a difference what Hitler and Mussolini wanted to get out of the war. Mussolini, it was a lot about prestige, a lot about creating that idea of Mare Nostrum, that old Roman Mare Nostrum, our sea with the Mediterranean. And it had ambitions. Early in the war, they took over the island of Majorca by themselves. They just put an airfield there, and that was very little coordination with the nationalist side. So they were very keen on doing their own things. And again, when it came to vehicles, at the very beginning, they were a bit more like the Germans. So the first tanks, the first foreign tanks to arrive in Spain were, on the nationalist side, were a number of CV-33s. 5 of them arrived in August 1936. So again, a month after the coup. And they were used in the north of Spain and under Spanish command. Then a second batch of about 10 arrived, and they were put together in a division, and which was under Spanish command. But then once Italy decided that they wanted to be more involved in the war, they were requisitioned again and used by the Italian volunteer force in Spain, the volunteer troops. I can't pronounce the Italian word for it. And then they sent more and more, and I think they sent 24 in January, February 1937 to help them in the offensive that they carried out almost by themselves in Guadalajara. Then 12 more were sent after the disaster at Guadalajara, 16 more in September 1937, and 12 in April 1938, and 32 in December 1938. So again, all the way up to December 1938, kept sending vehicles. Because although the war went on until April 1939, those last few months, there wasn't much of an equal war. It was very much a mopping up operations by the nationalists. So yeah, and with the Italians, it was just the CV-33-35, the Carro Veloce, but also the flamethrower variants, which, but yeah, these vehicles weren't very, I don't think they were very appreciated in Spain because they didn't have a turret. Their nickname was Sardine Tin, which is probably quite one of the more humorous nicknames in the Spanish Civil War for vehicles. They weren't really appreciated.
Was it also dangerous with them? Did they have malfunctions or something along those sides, or was it just because they were barely usable?
Well, again, it's not as well known as with the German ones how many needed maintenance, but they were very small. They had only these forward-facing machine guns. They weren't very, and in every single time they had to face opposition, they were always they didn't come up. They hardly ever came on the winning side when it was on that 1-to-1. But they did have successes mainly when they weren't facing armor.
So basically, when they went up against infantry, they were okay, but if the enemy had anti-tank weapons, yeah, it's not a good idea. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And with them, going back to the batches and how they arrived, the Soviets, their involvement was, again, a lot has been written about Soviet involvement in the Spanish Civil War. I wrote one of my undergrad pieces on Soviet involvement in the Spanish Civil War. So there's lots of opinions, and again, could go on for half an hour about that. But they sent they sent a large number of vehicles. They were the ones who contributed the most vehicles. They sent a large number of T-26s, which were probably the best tank of the Spanish Civil War, armed with a 45mm gun, quite sturdy. They were very well considered, and the last batch arrived in February 1938. But before that, there'd been several batches of. The smallest one was of 19. The biggest one was an individual batch was of 60, and these trickled in through between October 1936 and February 1938, by which point Stalin had lost interest in Spain. Those weren't the only vehicles they sent. They sent a single batch of 50 BT-5s, which, although were the most modern tank that took part in the war, they weren't very well considered. Their famous combat debut was at the Battle of Fuentes del Ebro, where 40% of all tanks that were sent were lost in just this one single engagement. And the Nationalists, who were very keen on taking T-26s into service, they used some B-25s, but they never used them operationally. They painted them in their colors, but they weren't that impressed with it. The Soviets did plan to send the other vehicles. They considered BT-2s, they considered T-28, and they even considered the T-35, the big multi-turreted vehicle, but they never sent these things. But yeah, which would have been quite a sight, I think, on the Spanish countryside. But none were sent, although plans were made. And you mentioned the Renault FTs, and that's probably quite one of the most interesting ones. Because Spain did have Renault FTs before the war. They'd acquired their first Renault FT in 1919, and had a few more after 1921 and 1925. They also had a few Schneider CA1s. One of these are the World War I French tanks. But so yeah, at the early stage of the war, the Republic was just very eager to gain as many armored vehicles as possible. So they reached out to France, and France was at the beginning quite sympathetic to the cause. They also had a popular French government led by Léon Blum in France, but under pressure from Britain and just the fears of a civil war in France, they were by the end quite hesitant to help Spain. But still, they sent a very small number of tanks. I think it was only 3 they sent in August 1936. And the Polish ones are by far the most interesting ones, because again, officially they couldn't send weapons to Spain, and because of the non-intervention agreement. So through arms traffickers, they were able to circumnavigate the restrictions placed by the non-intervention agreement. So the deal officially was that Poland was selling tanks to Uruguay, but actually those tanks was for Spain. And the first vehicles arrived, 16 vehicles arrived in November 1936 and took part almost immediately in fighting. And they were followed by a batch of 17 in March 1937. And then the exact numbers are lost. But I know some investigations that have been done into Polish army numbers find that probably as many as 72 Renault FTs were sent by Poland to Spain. Though again, it's unclear how many. And one of the things is that whilst other vehicles they had required a lot of training, Renault FTs had been in Spain since 1919. It was a vehicle that was known, and it is a vehicle that has been very influential to Spanish military history and armor development. Apart from that, the Republic, as I said, were very keen to get as much vehicles as they could. They tried to negotiate with Czechoslovakia to get the TNH, which probably most viewers will know better as the Panzer 38T. So they tried to negotiate that. There was some vehicles were being sold to Persia, to modern-day Iran, and Spain tried to get that batch for themselves, and then the negotiations didn't go as planned. So those vehicles never fought in Spain, and there's been for many hesitant to perpetuate this myth, but there's been some rumors that Spain also acquired a Vickers Type B tank from Paraguay, of all places, and Paraguay had captured this vehicle from Bolivia in the Chaco War in the 1930s. Again, yeah, very, very getting complicated stories. It was a fourth-hand vehicle, and there was rumors that Paraguay sent this vehicle to the Republic. Paraguay did indeed send weapons, but there's no evidence of this vehicle actually appearing in Spain. There's no photographic evidence, and very much until you see it, you can't say it was there. So again, I'll leave it open, and people are going to interpret it what they want. I've always been hesitant to believe that vehicle ever fought in Spain, but others are quite keen to say it did.
Okay, so now what is now in my mind? So the Soviet Union sent more tanks than Germany and Italy combined. The Italian tanks were not particularly good, and the Soviets had among them several T-26, which are very good, and also BT-5s, which are also, I think, quite a match for Panzer I. So were they used in the wrong way, or also did the Soviets fight themselves like the Italians, or was it more like the Germans?
It was a mix, actually. It was probably the middle point. And with the Italians, they did also train Spanish crews. And with once there'd been casualties with the Italians, lots of these tanks were crewed by Spanish crew members, or a mix of Italian and Spanish. With the Soviets, especially in the early days, the first tanks arrived on October 15th, 1936, and they were thrown straight into the battle. So lots of them were crewed by Soviet crews, although officially they shouldn't have been able to. But they were, for them, it was training crews, and they trained a lot of crews in Murcia, which was one of the coastal regions in the Mediterranean, and they recruited the potential crew drivers from bus drivers. There's not many cars on the Spanish roads at the time, so bus drivers, truck drivers, those were the people they recruited to then crew the tanks. But yeah, they did. Soviet crews did definitely participate, especially in the early days of the war. And command of the Soviet tank units was often given to Soviet officers. There was this one called Pavlov, was his name in Spain, because they normally have their names and then they have their Spanish names, and this was Pavlov. And he was killed in one of Stalin's purges once he got back to the Soviet Union. But he played a very crucial role in some of the early tank battles in Spain.
And were they not successful, or was it just that the Republicans lost everywhere else, and so the tank didn't make a major difference? So for me, because if I look at the numbers, I would say, okay, that looks very bad for the Nationalists. Of course, I know they had a better trained army, and tanks don't necessarily win a war. But so for me, the question is, was the influence not enough, or what are some major errors in using the tanks?
Well, there were times where they were very successful, and especially in the early days when they first appeared, the Soviet tanks did prove to be very decisive in the Battle of Madrid, for example, when people thought that all was lost. You got columns of Soviet tanks and armored cars and international brigadiers appearing and winning the battle. It's probably been for propaganda purposes and the romanticization of the Spanish Civil War. That's been overplayed a little bit, but they were very crucial there because 45mm gun was top gun in the Spanish Civil War. When the Republic was on the offensive, it didn't go so well, and they did distribute tanks among infantry units, and there was very poor combined arms training. And again, probably the debut of the T-26 in Spain is the best example of the success and failures just all within a few hours. There's this place called Cesena in the south of Madrid. That's where the T-26 made its debut in October 1936. And there was an attack by the Republican forces, and the Soviet T-26s just went on and on and on, just breaking through the Nationalist lines. But the infantry couldn't keep up. And the T-26 isn't a fast tank. And so they were able to destroy everything in their path. But once they got to the town of Cesena, that's when things went wrong, because they didn't have any infantry support, and the Nationalists started using early Molotov cocktails against these tanks and were able to surround them. But from these early stages, they did destroy a number of Italian tanks or CV-33s. But in the end, the number of Republican tank casualties was higher than the Nationalist casualties. And it was very much, I think that set the tone of, in this one-to-one combat, there was nothing better than the T-26. But when it got to, but often wars aren't that. They aren't 1v1 tanks. There is much more elements to it. And especially in these early days, it was poor. Again, the T-26 had only just arrived the week before. There'd been no time to train the troops on combined arms. the number of tanks in the Spanish army was very low. The amount of troops that they then side with the Republic was even smaller. So you can understand why this would happen, but there was an insistence on using these T-26s as mobile gun platforms, of mobile pillboxes, infantry support vehicles, which didn't suit them. They were never used in. There were times where they in Guadalajara, which was one of the famous Republican victories against a mainly Italian force. It was one of the very few examples that the T-26s were used in an effective way. Combined arms strategies were used, and that's where probably they were the most successful. But even back was like earlier than that, in the Jarama battle, again another Republican victory. Rare victories these are. The T-26s under the command of Pavlov, who I mentioned earlier, made an appearance and saved the day for the Republic, but at what cost? 40% of tanks were destroyed. So it was very much this. Whilst they were the most numerous tank force, they were effective. The number of vehicles that were knocked out were just too many, and the Republic didn't put enough effort to recover these vehicles and then maintenance and bringing them back to battle. Whereas the Nationalists did, they were happy to go and capture Soviet vehicles and then repurpose them. And there was something that has been always repeated in the sources about the Spanish Civil War, and I've never personally found the original evidence for it, but it's that each nationalist soldier who captured a Soviet tank was given 500 pesetas. So in modern day, that's only about $5, I think. But at the time, it was significant on top of their pay, and so especially the North African native troops in the Nationalist Army, there was lots of it's been written a lot of times that they were paid less than the Spanish troops, so they put a lot of effort into getting these Soviet tanks, capturing these Soviet tanks, and well, lots of them died in the process because they were just infantrymen tackling a tank. So, but yeah, no. So it was a mix, as I said, of the 1-to-1 that they were successful, the operational side not so successful.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I mean, if you send, I mean, one effect was also in the First World War, but also in the Russian Civil War, that infantry usually has a tank shock, but if you train them properly and say, okay, if there's only the tank, you let drive them past, and then you engage the infantry that follows, usually the tank will break down, have to turn around, or get lost, or if it goes into a city and gets Molotov cocktails, or the anti-tank weapons, or he reaches the artillery. Yeah, it's usually a problem for the tank. So yeah, if you have properly trained troops on the water side and the other side doesn't have, the side with the tanks doesn't have proper combined arms operations, it's not that, yeah, it comes all often down to doctrine. Now we talked a bit now how tanks were not well employed on the Republican side. So how were the tanks mostly deployed on the Nationalist side? So did they do it in a different way?
Yes and no. Yes and no. And as usually is the response. And I guess there's different evidence of how they were used. And probably with in early 1937, the southern city of Malaga fell to nationalist forces, and with these nationalist forces were spearheaded by the Italian volunteer troops, and with their CV-33-35s, and there is lots of literature surrounding the conflict and this battle in particular, which uses the term Italian blitzkrieg, of how they were used, and very rarely success and Italian tanks is that were used together. But this was a major success. Again, they weren't fighting any other armor, and there was very little anti-tanks, and there was the Republicans in Malaga were as occupied at fighting each other as they were fighting the Nationalists. But that was a success, regardless of what other caveats there is to it. But for the most part, yes, Nationalist tanks were used as infantry support vehicles for the most part, even though they were machine gun armed, the Panzer Is and the CV-33-35s. However, there was always a lot of pressure to use them differently from the German officers that were advising Franco. And the most important one was Wilhelm von Thoma, who was the head of the German ground forces in Spain. And he constantly put pressure on Franco, saying, no, you have to use them this way. And every now and again, Franco or one of Franco's generals would listen. And there were very effective uses of Panzer Is, mainly in the Nationalist counteroffensive in Teruel at the end of 1937, in the Aragon offensive in 1938, and then in the Catalonia offensive in 1938. But they would accumulate a number of Panzer Is together and use them as their own cohesive force rather than as a scatter throughout the infantry. So again, it was a slow learning, and there was a lot of hesitance. Again, doctrinal. There were few tanks in Spain, and the doctrine that existed was that they had to be used scattered among the infantry. Again, I guess that comes from the lessons of using them in North Africa. That was their role. It was to support infantry. They were slow tanks armed with machine guns. They'd never had any vehicles that were in any way fast, like the Panzer Is or the CV-33s. So it was a lot of learning. And I think it was a reluctance just of not knowing, but also like, well, this is our way, why we do it differently. But yeah, so definitely there were successes of using tanks differently. But as I said, lots of it came through pressure or from German officers.
Stubborn German officers. Yeah, we have to do this way. I can't imagine this. I mean, it was in South America, and it could also sometimes be quite stubborn if something didn't work out properly. So, anything else to add here from your side? Is there anything we haven't covered yet?
Well, I think I know I want to go a bit more into some other thing I said about the BT5s, and again, I think that again goes into how they were used, and they were a very fast tank, especially well, I still think they count as a very fast tank, but for the time they were definitely very fast, and they were used, and I know the Soviets did use them as well like this, but in Spain they were used to carry infantry into a battle. But what they didn't realize is just how fast they were. So a lot of infantry that were on top of these tanks just fell off and got run over by their following tanks.
That might also explain why I know that the Soviets sometimes in the Second World War they put on especially railings, or how you call them, I don't know, to hold on. It might actually date back to that.
And yeah, so yeah, that was quite a disastrous first use, and like I said, they lost 40% of the tanks in the 50 in the first use of them. And that the Nationalists were not very keen on using them, but the Italians captured one. But one of them was given to the Italians, and they sent it to Rome. And they also sent, as far as I remember, they also sent one of the armored cars, one of the BA armored cars, back to Rome to have a look at them and study what the Soviet weapons were. I don't know how much influence they had on them posterior Italian arms development, but it's one of those curious little things about the Spanish Civil War. And one of the other things, I guess, it's that with the T-26, and it had a hell of an impact really on the Spanish Civil War, because it's 45mm gun, sturdy, it was sturdy and whatnot, and it was since they first appeared in October 1936, the Nationalists had to come up with ways of how to defeat this wonder weapon almost in a Spanish Civil War context. And so they came up with different plans. That the German, they always requested from Germany to send anything that was equipped with a more potent gun. There were Spanish armor developments, were using German and Italian vehicles to try and counter this. But at the end, the solution was just capture as many of these as you can. And one of the ironic things is when the Nationalist Army had won the war in 1939 and counted the number of vehicles they had, the most numerous vehicle they had in their inventory was C-26s, not the Panzer Is that Germany sends, not the CV-33, 35s that Italy had left, but it was the T-26s which had been sent to their enemies, their republic. I think that says quite a lot of their use, and they were used in the post-war period. Spain did receive during World War II a number of Panzer IVs, only about 20, and then Spain was thrown into ostracism, international. It was an international pariah state almost because of their support for Germany and Italy during World War II. And once then the Cold War set in, that changed things a little bit. But the T-26s continued, and I think the last recorded use of them was in 1956 or something like that, as mainly as training tanks, but they were still used by that point, and I think it is a tank that had a lot of impact on Spain.
So there's still quite a lot left in Spain in museums, or
There
not?
is, yes, there are a few, and one that I've not been able to visit many of them, but there's one that is in North Madrid, and they've got three T-26s. It's the most individual numerous tank they've got. They have two Panzer Is, they have one CV-33, and they've got three T-26s, which again I think says quite a lot about just how popular they were. And in other museums there are a number more.
Is there BT5 also left?
No, not to my knowledge. I don't seem to recall any single BT5s remaining in Spain.
So do you know why the Nationalists were not very keen on the BT5?
I don't recall reading anything specific of why it wasn't like, but I think it was just some of its features, because with like all BT tanks of the series, they had that ability of running on tracks and running on wheels, and which proved to be quite unsuccessful. I think in Spain they found that pretty quickly. I thought it may be sold as quite an innovative feature, but well, it has very little actual appliance. Because there were very few good roads or good enough roads to use them anyway. And so I think it was a lot of them had been destroyed. So there was only very small numbers, not that many availability of spare parts. So the main thing was the turret. It was the cannon, but they could always take it off a BT5 to put it on a T-26, which they did like. So I think it was very much of they found no use for it because they didn't use tanks that way. Again, this is me speculating more than knowing for certain, but again, I think it is quite telling of just they were happy to use captured Renault FTs, but they weren't using BT5s.
I mean, it kind of makes sense. As you mentioned before, the Germans had to convince them to use the Panzer Is in a different way. And if you use your tanks like the FT in an infantry support role, a fast BT5, because it's even fast on tracks, it's not particularly useful. It's like, yeah, it's like having a Lamborghini or a Ferrari if you're only allowed to drive 30 kilometers per hour. It's yeah, okay. Well, I take my Golf, I take my Toyota in that case anyway, because that's less of a hassle, I guess. So it probably comes down maybe to this.
They did find some use to them. They did find it, and it's there was there's this famous picture of a BT5 that was used as some buffers at the end of a line. So a train barrier buffers. There's these pictures of a BT5 that was just used as buffers for trains, and because that's the use they found for it.
The poor BT5. I mean, I don't know enough about the BT5. I know a BT7 a bit better, but I think they are very similar. I might be terribly wrong here, but I generally have in memory that it's actually a decent tank, but if I'm not mistaken.
Again, I'm not an expert on the BT5, and most of my knowledge about Soviet stuff is what they did in Spain. So again, quite limited. But yeah, I don't think it was. I think it comes down to the operational side of how they could be used, which we've covered, rather than anything being wrong. Because I think the most important fact is that it had a 45mm gun, which was in the Spanish War was the top. It was the same gun that was being used in the T-26. Was the same gun that was used in the Soviet armored cars and some of the Spanish-made armored cars. So it was very much its faults were more an operational doctrinal side.
Okay, I'm a bit speculating here. I could be terribly wrong. As far as I remember, the BT tanks were rather narrow in a way. So could it also be that due to terrain, that the chance that they tipping over was quite high? I mean, especially in comparison to the T-26, which was rather wide. Could it come down to that this was a problem?
Not to my knowledge. It could be. It could well not be. But again, I don't think that's something that I've not come across enough evidence.
So there's no like we had several accidents or something along those lines. Nothing. Okay, yeah. Then Gareth, thank you very much on these various insights.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So be sure to check out Tank Encyclopedia website and the magazine. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.